The tranquil morning of March 18, 1943, unfolded like any customary training session at Naval Air Station Jacksonville. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley observed his fledgling dive bomber students as they embarked upon their SBD Dauntless, the very same formidable aircraft that had decisively altered the trajectory of the Battle of Midway merely 9 months prior. However, a disquieting anomaly marred the statistical data. Over the preceding 6 weeks, Flatley had tragically witnessed the loss of more aviators to training mishaps than he had experienced in the entirety of the Guadalcanal campaign's actual combat engagements. The recurring pattern was unequivocally evident and profoundly alarming. These were not the typical blunders of inexperienced recruits or unforeseen mechanical malfunctions. Seasoned pilots, individuals who had already endured and survived perilous combat missions, were executing impeccably precise dive bombing maneuvers, only to plunge inexorably into the vast expanse of the ocean. Reports emanating from other naval air training facilities corroborated this unsettling scenario. At NS Corpus Christi, at NS Pensacola, and across numerous airfields throughout the nation, dive bomber pilots were perishing in a manner that defied all logical tactical explanation. They would meticulously roll inverted, initiate their descent into the dive, maintain the exacting 70-degree angle mandated by operational doctrine, flawlessly track their designated targets through the bomb site, and then, inexplicably, fail to execute the crucial pullout. There were no frantic radio transmissions signaling distress, nor any erratic aerial maneuvers indicative of control system failures. The aircraft would steadfastly maintain that precipitous dive angle, continuing its plunge past the designated bomb release point, past the critical safe pullout altitude, until the immutable laws of physics rendered recovery an absolute impossibility. Crash investigators, meticulously examining the wreckage, consistently discovered the control surfaces to be fully intact, the engines operating without fault, and the airframes undamaged save for the cataclysmic impact. It was as if the pilots had succumbed to slumber at the most critical juncture. Yet, they had not fallen asleep. The insidious phenomenon unfolding within those cockpits was far more sinister than mere fatigue. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics had been receiving a growing number of unsettling field reports since late 1942, but the sheer magnitude of the predicament only became undeniably apparent when squadron after squadron began suffering pilot casualties attributed to what the official communiques euphemistically termed failure to recover from dive. This carefully worded phrase served to obscure a harsher, more inconvenient truth that no one was eager to confront. The very dive bombing technique that had secured victory at the pivotal Battle of Midway was now indiscriminately claiming the lives of the skilled men who had painstakingly mastered it. The inherent precision and rigorous discipline that rendered dive bombing so devastatingly effective against Japanese naval assets had inadvertently created a physiological quagmire that the human biological system was simply not equipped to endure. Commander Flatley, recognizing the gravity of the situation, initiated a series of discussions and comparisons of observations with his counterparts, other training officers at various bases. A deeply disturbing consensus quickly materialized. The pilots who were tragically perishing were not the slipshod aviators prone to cutting corners, nor were they the reckless daredevils who habitually pushed the boundaries of their aircraft and their own capabilities. Instead, they were the meticulously precise, by-the-book aviators who adhered to operational doctrine with unwavering fidelity, executing every maneuver exactly as prescribed. These were the individuals who held their dives to the absolute last possible second, striving for the pinnacle of accuracy. They were the ones who had deeply internalized the unforgiving, brutal mathematics intrinsic to dive bombing. Every additional 100 feet of altitude retained at the point of bomb release translated into dozens of feet of potential deviation from the target. When engaging a swiftly maneuvering enemy warship, that seemingly minor missed distance could represent the critical difference between a direct hit and a lamentably wasted ordnance. Consequently, these dedicated pilots had rigorously trained themselves to delay, to maintain that screaming descent, to keep the target precisely centered within their sights until the absolute final instant before initiating the pull-out maneuver. And that unwavering discipline, that profound commitment to achieving unparalleled accuracy, was now systematically killing them in numbers so substantial that it posed a grave threat to the operational readiness of the entire dive bomber force. What had not been thoroughly or accurately calculated was the profound physiological impact on the human body when a 2-ton aircraft transitions from a 70-degree dive at a blistering 300 miles per hour into a recovery arc. The aerodynamic and kinematic mathematics were relatively straightforward and well understood. The human physiology, however, proved to be far more complex and unforgiving. When a pilot exerted force on the control stick, pulling it back to commence the pullout, he was not merely altering the aircraft's trajectory. He was simultaneously subjecting his entire circulatory system to immense forces that it had never, through the course of evolution, developed the capacity to adequately handle. At the nadir of a typical dive bombing pullout, pilots routinely experience between 5 and 7 gs of acceleration, signifying that their blood instantaneously became 5 to 7 times its normal weight. That blood, inexorably obeying the pitiless dictates of physics, was forcefully drained away from the brain, pooling instead in the lower extremities and legs. This devastating sequence of events unfolded with a rapidity that conscious thought could scarcely process or track. The initial manifestation was the loss of peripheral vision, a phenomenon pilots colloquially termed grayout. The outer edges of the visual field would progressively fade into a colorless, indistinct fog as the retinas, deprived of oxygen-rich blood, began to cease functioning, starting from the periphery inwards. This typically occurred at approximately 4 gs and afforded the pilot a mere 2 seconds of anticipatory warning. This was swiftly followed by tunnel vision, where only the central portion of the visual field remained functional, constricting into a narrow, circular aperture that rendered the reading of critical flight instruments nearly impossible. At 5.5 gs, the majority of pilots would experience a complete blackout, a total and abrupt loss of vision, while paradoxically remaining technically conscious. At 6 gs and beyond, consciousness itself would begin to recede. The brain, receiving perhaps a mere 30% of its normal blood flow, would simply shut down as a protective mechanism, entering a state of temporary neurological dormancy. Herein lay the treacherous core of dive bombing. The entire pull-out maneuver, from its initiation to the aircraft achieving wings-level flight, typically spanned a duration of between 4 and 6 seconds. However, G-induced blackout could commence in less than 2 seconds, and complete unconsciousness could follow within a mere 4 seconds. The timing of these physiological responses was catastrophically incongruous with the demands of the maneuver. A pilot would initiate his pullout, feel the escalating G-forces intensifying, perceive his vision beginning to constrict, and then his conscious mind would tragically vanish precisely at the moment of its most critical necessity. The control stick would slacken, the pullout would involuntarily cease halfway through its intended arc, and the aircraft would continue its uncontrolled dive into the unforgiving water, with an unconscious pilot helplessly at the controls. Even more tragically, when the oppressive G-forces finally abated, either because the aircraft entered a terminal spiral or simply because it impacted the water, consciousness would occasionally return in that ultimate, fleeting second. This agonizing flicker of awareness would grant the pilot just enough time to comprehend the horrifying inevitability of his imminent demise. The Navy's Bureau of Medicine, in a concerted effort to understand and mitigate this crisis, conducted rigorous tests at the sophisticated centrifuge facility located in Pensacola. Volunteer pilots were subjected to the precise G profiles that had been meticulously measured during actual dive bombing pullouts. The results of these experiments were profoundly sobering. When pilots were forewarned of the impending high G forces and instructed to consciously tense their leg and abdominal muscles, a physiological countermaneuver known to delay blackout by a crucial second or two, they demonstrated the ability to maintain consciousness through pullouts that would otherwise have rendered them completely incapacitated. However, in the exigencies of actual flight, during the frantic final seconds of a dive, with the target rapidly hurtling towards them, and their attention completely engrossed in maintaining the bomb site's pipper precisely centered, pilots consistently neglected to perform the anti-G straining maneuvers. Their conscious minds were simply too saturated with the immediate, critical tasks at hand. By the time they began the pullout, it was already too late to adequately prepare their bodies for the crushing forces that were about to engulf them. The German Luftwaffe had independently encountered this identical, perplexing problem 4 years prior, and their subsequent solution proved to be as brutally effective as it was ingenious. In 1939, during the combat trials of the formidable Junkers Ju-87 Stuka over the battlefields of Poland, the Luftwaffe tragically lost 7 aircraft within a single week to a series of inexplicable dive accidents. Highly experienced pilots, individuals who had performed flawlessly throughout their rigorous training regimens, were inexplicably auguring their aircraft straight into Polish farmland, their bombs still attached. The subsequent investigation unequivocally revealed that experienced pilots were blacking out during pullouts at rates that rendered the Stuka's operational deployment unsustainable. However, unlike the Americans who would confront this identical crisis years later, the Germans benefited from the direct involvement of an astute engineer named Hans Ulrich Rudd, who worked in close collaboration with the design teams at Junkers. Rudd, with remarkable foresight, advocated for a radical solution that entirely circumvented the fallibility of the human element. By the nascent months of 1940, every Stuka rolling off the production line was meticulously equipped with an innovative automatic pull-out system. The mechanism itself was ingeniously simple in its design. The pilot would preset a desired recovery altitude on a barometric switch before initiating his dive. Subsequently, when the aircraft descended and reached that predetermined altitude, pneumatic actuators would automatically and forcefully haul the control column backward, entirely irrespective of the pilot's current actions or state. Even if the pilot was utterly unconscious, even if he had completely relinquished his grip on the control stick, the aircraft would autonomously pull itself out of the perilous dive. The system incorporated a crucial mechanical override, a prominently located large red handle that the pilot could engage to regain manual control. However, activating that override necessitated a conscious decision. If the pilot had blacked out, the automation would unfailingly save his life without requiring any input or action from him whatsoever. The implementation of this system yielded immediate and profoundly dramatic results. Stuka loss rates attributable to dive accidents plummeted by over 80% within 3 months of the system's widespread deployment across the fleet. Pilots recounted experiencing the control stick wrenching itself backward during pullouts they barely remembered initiating. Some aviators described regaining full consciousness in level flight with absolutely no recollection of the preceding 5 seconds of intense maneuver. The automatic system inadvertently conferred a secondary, unforeseen benefit. It empowered pilots to prolong their dives for extended durations. The knowledge that the aircraft would autonomously recover itself at a preset altitude meant that pilots could keep their bomb sights precisely on target through those final, critical seconds without the added mental burden of initiating the pull-out maneuver. They could focus their entire attention and skill on achieving unparalleled accuracy, implicitly trusting the mechanical system to safeguard them from the potentially fatal physiological consequences. However, when American intelligence officers meticulously examined captured Stukas in North Africa during the years 1941 and 1942, they regrettably dismissed the automatic pull-out system as merely another instance of typical German over-engineering. The American aviation community, at that time, harbored a deeply ingrained cultural skepticism toward automation. The prevailing ethos dictated that pilots were inherently responsible for flying their aircraft, not for allowing machines to perform that duty for them. The dominant attitude was that properly trained aviators should not require mechanical assistance to prevent blacking out. Instead, they should simply strive to be superior pilots. The prevailing sentiment, steeped in a culture of individual prowess, stubbornly insisted that aviators should simply be superior pilots, overcoming any operational challenges through sheer skill and fortitude. This deeply ingrained attitude persisted with remarkable tenacity, even as the accumulating stack of accident reports painted an increasingly grim and undeniable picture of systemic failure. When a team of United States Navy test pilots meticulously evaluated a captured German Ju-87 dive bomber at Naval Air Station Patuxent River in December 1942, their official assessment acknowledged the presence of its innovative automatic pull-out system. However, they critically characterized this crucial safety feature not as a viable solution to an inherent physiological limitation, but rather as a mere crutch designed for pilots deemed to possess insufficient personal skill. This flawed and complacent judgment, tragically, would continue to exact a heavy toll in American lives for an additional 8 agonizing months before the harsh realities of combat and training losses finally compelled a fundamental reevaluation and a much-needed doctrinal shift. The esteemed Air Group 3, operating from the formidable deck of the USS Yorktown, had justly earned an exceptional reputation for its unparalleled precision and unwavering combat effectiveness. These were not green, inexperienced replacements recently graduated from basic flight school. Quite the contrary, they were highly seasoned combat veterans who had rigorously honed their deadly craft and proven their mettle in the brutal and unforgiving crucible of the Solomons campaign. These were men of extraordinary capability, renowned for their uncanny ability to accurately deliver a massive 1,000-pound bomb squarely onto the narrow deck of a moving enemy destroyer, even when commencing their perilous attack from an astounding altitude of 10,000 feet. Nevertheless, on the fateful day of March 22, 1943, during what was intended to be a wholly routine training maneuver conducted off the sun-drenched Florida coast, a chilling and unexpected tragedy transpired. Lieutenant Robert Chin inexplicably failed to execute his aircraft's recovery from its precipitous dive. His horrified wingman, Ensign Marcus Webb, bore witness as Chin's SPD Dauntless relentlessly maintained its steep angle of descent, soaring far beyond the designated bomb release point, and then continuing past the critical altitude where the pull-out phase should have undeniably commenced, until it ultimately plunged into the unforgiving water with a catastrophic vertical impact that left behind virtually no salvageable debris for recovery. Tragically, Chin's demise marked the squadron's third loss of life within a mere fortnight, and the grim tally was, horrifyingly, far from complete. Just 5 days subsequent to this incident, Lieutenant William Stamper embarked upon his dive during an identical training exercise, echoing the chilling and inexplicable pattern. His radio communications remained eerily silent, and his aircraft stubbornly adhered to its predetermined, fatal trajectory. From the deck of the USS Yorktown, anxious observers tracked the unfolding tragedy through powerful binoculars, watching in disbelief as Stamper's SPD relentlessly maintained its dive through every critical altitude marker, all the while anticipating a recovery maneuver that, horrifyingly, never materialized. The subsequent impact generated a colossal plume of pristine white water, a stark and unmistakable monument to the tragedy, clearly discernible across many miles of open sea. Adding another layer of profound irony and tragedy to the unfolding crisis, it was revealed that Stamper had previously served as Lieutenant Chen's esteemed flight instructor, a testament to his own exceptional expertise and seasoned experience. This was a man who had not only endured but triumphed in the ferocious carrier engagements of Coral Sea and Santa Cruz, battles that had tested the very limits of human endurance and skill. He boasted an impressive and meticulously logged record of over 300 successful carrier landings, an achievement that spoke volumes about his seasoned capabilities. Yet, he perished during a seemingly mundane training exercise, one he was so proficient in that he could have ostensibly executed it in his slumber. Upon the squadron's return to the USS Yorktown later that afternoon, the commanding officer, grappling with the weight of these inexplicable and mounting losses, immediately ordered the grounding of the entire dive bomber contingent, instigating an urgent and comprehensive investigation. Admiral Mark Mitcher, the formidable commander overseeing fast carrier task force operations, had, by this point, accumulated more than enough distressing evidence to warrant decisive and uncompromising action. With unwavering conviction, he issued a direct mandate to the Bureau of Aeronautics, instructing them to cease categorizing these recurring tragedies as mere isolated misfortunes and, instead, to confront them as an undeniable, profound systemic crisis demanding immediate and thorough attention. The extensive and meticulous investigation that consequently ensued meticulously aggregated critical data and operational reports from every single Navy and Marine Corps dive bomber squadron actively deployed across both the vast Atlantic and the expansive Pacific theaters of war. The statistical revelations unearthed by the comprehensive inquiry proved nothing short of staggering, starkly exposing the horrific scale of the burgeoning crisis. Within a relatively brief span, specifically between November 1942 and April 1943, the United States Navy had suffered the devastating loss of 47 highly trained dive bomber pilots due solely to catastrophic pull-out failures occurring during routine training operations. This grim figure astonishingly surpassed the total number of aviators lost to direct enemy action throughout that identical timeframe. Furthermore, reports filtering in from active combat squadrons indicated that an alarming 15 to 20% of their pilots were experiencing at least a partial visual blackout, or grayout, during actual operational dives. This pervasive physiological vulnerability had already compromised the success of numerous critical combat missions, as section leaders occasionally succumbed to unconsciousness mid-attack, forcing their vigilant wingmen to abort their own bombing runs and divert to escort their incapacitated comrades to safety. In response to this escalating catastrophe, the Bureau promptly convened an urgent emergency panel at the Anacostia Naval Air Station. This critical assembly gathered an impressive array of multidisciplinary experts, including highly specialized flight surgeons, visionary aircraft designers, seasoned combat squadron leaders, and crucially, pilots who had themselves miraculously survived harrowing blackout incidents. For an intense and concentrated period of 3 days in early April, these dedicated professionals meticulously deconstructed and exhaustively re-examined every preconceived notion and established principle concerning dive bombing technique. As part of this rigorous inquiry, courageous test pilots undertook a series of instrumented dives, meticulously equipped with advanced medical monitoring apparatus securely fastened to their chests, precisely recording the dynamic fluctuations in heart rate, blood pressure, and vital blood oxygen levels throughout every distinct phase of both the perilous descent and the subsequent recovery maneuver. Further augmenting the scientific scrutiny, high-speed cameras, strategically positioned within accompanying chase aircraft, meticulously documented the precise instant when pilots' heads involuntarily slumped forward or their hands slackened, releasing their grip from the vital control stick. The cumulative evidence gathered from these exhaustive tests was utterly irrefutable, painting a stark and undeniable picture. It unequivocally demonstrated that the standard dive bombing profile, a technique rigorously instilled in every United States Navy flight school, was fundamentally and tragically physiologically unsustainable. In essence, aviators were being instructed to execute a high-stress maneuver that the inherent limitations of human biology simply could not reliably endure. A profound shift in doctrine was imperative, yet a significant impasse emerged. No member of the distinguished panel could reach a consensus on how to fundamentally alter this perilous technique without simultaneously compromising the critical bombing accuracy that initially justified the very existence and tactical value of dive bombing. Remarkably, the much-needed breakthrough, a solution to this seemingly intractable problem, emerged from an entirely unforeseen quarter. It did not originate from the esteemed ranks of the admirals or the specialized expertise of the flight surgeons, but rather from a relatively junior officer, Lieutenant Junior Grade Thomas Riley. This intrepid aviator had been bravely flying perilous combat missions from the deck of the legendary USS Enterprise ever since the pivotal Battle of Midway. Unbeknownst to his superiors, Riley had independently begun employing a radical technique that flagrantly contravened every established principle of conventional dive bombing doctrine, and he had maintained a discreet silence about his unorthodox methods, fearing he would face severe disciplinary action. In stark contrast to the rigorously prescribed protocol, which mandated initiating the aircraft's pull-out maneuver at a minimum altitude of 2,500 feet, and releasing the ordnance during the nascent phase of the recovery arc, Riley had adopted a radically different approach. He was consistently extending his dives to much lower altitudes, frequently descending to 2,000 feet, and on occasion, even pushing the limits to 1,800 feet, before deploying his bomb at this significantly reduced height, a point at which his aircraft remained almost perfectly vertical. Subsequently, he would then execute a more measured and gradual pullout, a technique designed to effectively distribute the intense G-forces over a substantially extended duration, thereby mitigating their peak impact. From the perspective of the official flight manual and established tactical doctrine, Riley's innovative technique appeared to be entirely counterintuitive, indeed, fundamentally backwards. The prevailing wisdom dictated an early bomb release during the pull-out sequence, specifically to afford the pilot the maximum possible recovery time and safety margin. Yet, paradoxically, Lieutenant Riley's recorded bombing scores were consistently and inexplicably superior to those achieved by every other pilot within his squadron. Furthermore, and perhaps most compellingly, he had never once reported experiencing even a partial visual obscuration, or grayout, let alone a full blackout, during his daring maneuvers. When Lieutenant Riley eventually unveiled and thoroughly elucidated his unconventional technique during the high-stakes Anacostia conference, the immediate reaction from the assembled experts was one of profound skepticism, bordering distinctly on outright hostility. A senior commander, representing the authoritative Bureau of Aeronautics, unequivocally informed Riley that he was, in no uncertain terms, fabricating his claims regarding such extraordinarily low release altitudes. The commander asserted that achieving any semblance of consistent bombing accuracy from below 2,000 feet was an absolute impossibility, adding that the sophisticated bombsight calculations themselves were never designed to even consider or accommodate releases from such dramatically reduced heights. However, Lieutenant Riley possessed irrefutable evidence, meticulously recorded gun camera footage. Upon the panel's careful and thorough review of these visual records, they were confronted with a revelation that fundamentally challenged and utterly contradicted every established tenet they believed they understood about the intricate science of bombing accuracy. Astonishingly, Riley's deployed ordnance consistently struck within a circular error probable (CP) of merely 35 feet, a performance metric that was not only superior, but substantially better than the 65-foot CP, which had previously been lauded and considered the benchmark for excellent dive bombing precision. The underlying rationale for this remarkable discrepancy swiftly became unequivocally clear once the diligent aerodynamicists meticulously crunched the complex numerical data. The conventional, standard technique involved releasing the bomb relatively early within the pull-out arc, typically when the attacking aircraft was transitioning through a dive angle of approximately 60 degrees. At such an oblique angle, the released ordnance possessed a considerable horizontal velocity component, a factor that necessitated intricate calculations and precise corrections by the pilot. Moreover, the influence of prevailing wind conditions was often substantial, further complicating the trajectory. Consequently, the bomb's flight path described a highly intricate parabolic curve, demanding that the pilot skillfully lead the intended target and accurately factor in a multitude of dynamic variables for a successful strike. In stark contrast, Lieutenant Riley's innovative ultra-low releases occurred at a point where his aircraft remained almost perfectly vertical, plunging nose down at an acute angle typically ranging between 75 and 85 degrees. At this exceptionally steep attitude, the deployed bomb descended nearly straight downwards, exhibiting only a minimal horizontal velocity component. Consequently, the disruptive influence of atmospheric wind effects became practically negligible. The resulting trajectory, from the precise moment of release to the point of impact, was essentially a direct, straight line. This ballistic simplicity was the key, and in the intricate world of aerial ordnance delivery, such simplicity translated directly and unequivocally into superior accuracy. Intriguingly, the bombsight mathematics, which had been previously dismissed as unsuitable or even erroneous for such extremely low-altitude releases, was, in fact, discovered to be perfectly sound and remarkably accurate. The fundamental issue was that this particular operational envelope had simply never been subjected to proper, empirical testing, precisely because established doctrine emphatically declared that any pilot daring to descend to such perilous depths would inevitably perish before completing the maneuver. The physiological advantage concerning G-forces proved to be equally significant and transformative. By skillfully extending the duration of his dive, and subsequently executing a more deliberate and gradual pull-out, Riley effectively distributed the identical total G-load over an elongated period, stretching it across 7 or 8 seconds rather than compressing its entirety into a mere 4 seconds. This extended G-force distribution resulted in significantly lower peak G-forces, hovering around a manageable 4.5 gs, a stark reduction from the perilous 6 or 7 gs generated by the conventional technique. This crucial difference maintained him securely beneath the critical physiological blackout threshold. Even more profoundly, the gradual and progressive onset of these forces afforded his cardiovascular system invaluable time to adequately compensate for the immense strain. His blood pressure could dynamically adjust. He could maintain his rigorous anti-G straining maneuvers consistently throughout the entire recovery process, rather than having his body's defenses instantly overwhelmed by an abrupt and catastrophic spike in gravitational stress. Undeniably, the execution of this revised technique demanded an extraordinary degree of nerve and unwavering psychological fortitude. It necessitated pushing the aircraft deeper into the perceived danger zone before initiating the critical recovery sequence. However, the underlying physical principles and aerodynamic calculations supporting its efficacy were utterly irrefutable, leaving no room for doubt. The evidence overwhelmingly demonstrated that these lower, more protracted pullouts were unequivocally both safer for the aviators and demonstrably more accurate in ordnance delivery, directly contradicting the ingrained, perilous doctrine that had tragically been claiming the lives of pilots week after agonizing week. It was revealed that the esteemed National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, had, in fact, been diligently conducting extensive wind tunnel research into bomb trajectories since as early as 1941. Yet, astonishingly, no one within the established aviation community had conceived of applying their invaluable data to the specific parameters of ultra-low altitude releases until Lieutenant Riley's groundbreaking technique compelled a comprehensive and urgent reevaluation. When the highly skilled NACA engineers at the renowned Langley Research Center meticulously ran their full suite of sophisticated aerodynamic models, they uncovered a fundamental truth that, in retrospect, should have been glaringly apparent, but had remained stubbornly obscured by decades of deeply ingrained doctrinal assumptions and conventional wisdom. The analysis conclusively demonstrated that the standard 2,500-foot release point, a cornerstone of traditional dive bombing protocol, had never been selected primarily for its contribution to bombing accuracy. Instead, its adoption was fundamentally predicated upon considerations of pilot safety, designed to afford aviators the maximum possible duration for recovery should any unforeseen complication arise during the critical pullout phase. However, this purported safety margin had been meticulously calculated under a crucial, yet ultimately erroneous, assumption that pilots would consistently remain entirely conscious and fully capable throughout the entirety of the physically demanding recovery maneuver. This foundational assumption, as the recent tragic events and scientific investigations had unequivocally proven, was demonstrably and tragically false. The exhaustive wind tunnel data unequivocally illuminated the precise aerodynamic reasons why these significantly lower bomb releases consistently yielded much tighter and more accurate impact patterns. When a bomb was deployed at the conventional altitude of 2,500 feet during the initial phase of a pullout, it typically traversed approximately 180 feet of horizontal displacement before ultimately striking its target. Throughout this extended flight duration, the ordnance was highly susceptible to a multitude of environmental influences, including unpredictable wind drift, subtle yet impactful variations in air density, and the intricate, often turbulent, aerodynamic interactions between the bomb stabilizing fins and the disturbed air trailing behind the rapidly diving aircraft. Even minuscule discrepancies in the precise timing of the release, deviations as slight as a mere tenth of a second, could tragically translate into a substantial missed distance of 15 or even 20 feet from the intended target. Conversely, a bomb released at a daring 1,800 feet, while the aircraft remained in a nearly vertical attitude, traveled a significantly reduced horizontal distance, perhaps only 40 feet, prior to impact. This abbreviated flight time, coupled with a simpler, more direct trajectory, dramatically curtailed the margin for error. Consequently, the same release timing variations that would precipitate considerable misses at higher altitudes resulted in only negligible deviations when the ordnance was deployed from these much lower, near vertical positions. The tangible evidence for this critical adjustment arrived through a meticulous analysis of combat footage. Since the pivotal engagement at Midway, the Navy had diligently documented every aerial engagement, meticulously collecting gun camera film from each combat mission. This extensive archive contained granular, frame-by-frame records detailing thousands of bomb releases, each accompanied by clearly visible impact points. When dedicated analysts later revisited this vast repository of film, specifically scrutinizing release altitudes and their corresponding accuracy, the indisputable relationship between the two factors became profoundly clear, leaving no room for doubt. Naval aviators who executed their bomb releases from altitudes below 2,000 feet, whether through intentional adherence to an emerging tactic, as exemplified by Riley, or inadvertently by prolonging their dive trajectories, consistently demonstrated a remarkable 40% reduction in the dispersion of their impact patterns compared to those who adhered to the prescribed 2,500-foot doctrinal release altitude. Furthermore, the very lowest releases, specifically those conducted within the narrow window of 1,600 to 900 feet, yielded a level of accuracy that strikingly rivaled the precision previously attainable solely through glide bombing attacks, which were, by their nature, conducted at significantly reduced airspeeds. The intricate dynamics of G-force distribution then elucidated the remaining facets of this revelation. Employing accelerometers meticulously installed within specialized test aircraft, aeronautical engineers precisely charted the specific G-loading characteristics associated with pullouts initiated from varying altitudes. A recovery maneuver commenced at the conventional 2,500-foot mark inherently necessitated an immediate and maximal application of aft stick pressure. At this elevated point, the pilot was already rapidly depleting their available vertical separation, compelling them to arrest the precipitous dive with the utmost urgency and speed. Such an abrupt and forceful recovery invariably produced the notorious 6 to 7 G spike, the very physiological stressor responsible for inducing pilot blackouts. In stark contrast, a pull-out maneuver initiated at 1,800 feet could be executed with a significantly more gradual trajectory, precisely owing to its initiation from a substantially lower altitude. While the pilot was undeniably closer to the water surface, their aircraft was simultaneously oriented in a more vertical attitude, a configuration that inherently permitted an extended, more graceful recovery trajectory. Rather than abruptly wrenching the control stick aft, the pilot could now exert consistent, measured aft pressure, allowing the aircraft to smoothly transition out of the dive across an extended time frame. This revised approach achieved the identical change in altitude but through significantly attenuated physiological stresses. The peak G-load consistently remained below 5 gs, a level comfortably within the operational envelope where aviators could sustain complete cognitive awareness and continue to function effectively without impairment. While revising operational doctrine presented a considerable undertaking, the monumental task of retraining an entire combat aviation force to execute maneuvers diametrically opposed to their deeply ingrained muscle memory represented an altogether different, formidable challenge. Consequently, in June 1943, the Navy moved to establish an experimental dive bombing school at Naval Air Station Jacksonville, directly overseen by Commander Fladley. The entire curriculum was completely re-engineered from the ground up, centering on what they officially designated as the delayed pull-out technique, though aviators in the field quickly coined their own more colloquial terms, such as riding the edge, or simply the late pull. The paramount initial challenge confronting the new methodology was inherently psychological, the formidable task of persuading seasoned aviators that descending closer to the water surface before initiating recovery was not an act of perilous, suicidal recklessness, but rather a demonstrably safer methodology. Consequently, the instructional regimen commenced with intensive classroom sessions, which often bore a closer resemblance to advanced physics seminars rather than conventional flight briefings. Pilots meticulously absorbed presentations on G-induced loss of consciousness, GLOC, complete with intricate charts illustrating cerebral blood flow patterns during high G maneuvers and detailed graphs correlating G onset rates with the probability of blackout. Flight surgeons provided precise explanations of the physiological cascade that occurred within the human visual system when the retinas were deprived of adequate oxygenation. The instructors diligently ensured that every pilot grasped the fundamental truth. This transformation was not a test of individual bravery or inherent piloting skill, but rather an immutable physiological reality. Even the most courageous and adept aviator in the world would inevitably black out at 6 gs if the pull was executed too forcefully or too rapidly. The overarching objective was not to heroically resist the G-forces, but rather to judiciously manage them, strategically dispersing their impact over an extended temporal duration, thereby allowing the human body to adapt progressively instead of succumbing to an abrupt shutdown. Following the theoretical grounding, the training progressed to intensive instrument flight training. The adoption of this novel technique fundamentally demanded that pilots implicitly rely upon their altimeters, particularly in scenarios where every primal instinct vehemently urged them to initiate an immediate recovery. Instructors meticulously guided aviators through practice sessions within link trainers, which, despite being rudimentary yet effective flight simulators, proved invaluable. Here, pilots repeatedly executed dive profiles while vocally articulating their altitudes without interruption, reciting a precise sequence. Passing 3,000, holding angle. Passing 2,500, holding angle. Passing 2,000, sight picture, steady. 1,800, initiating pullout. This regimen of verbal callouts served to maintain their conscious cognitive engagement and actively counteracted the onset of tunnel vision, a common precursor to altitude awareness loss. Aviators practiced relentlessly until these callouts evolved into an automatic, almost rhythmic verbalization, a consistent internal monologue that would persist even under the most extreme combat stress. The actual flight training component introduced the novel technique through meticulously graduated phases. Initial flights comprised practice dives, unburdened by ordnance, with pullouts commencing at 2,200 feet, a mere 300 feet lower than the former doctrine. Instructors flew in close chase formation, providing uninterrupted altitude advisories via radio. Pilots diligently learned to discern the precise visual indicators corresponding to 1,800 feet, the apparent size of the target, the specific way the topography of the horizon presented itself, and the exact visual tableau that signaled the critical moment for action. They honed the art of the gradual pullout, mastering the application of steady back pressure rather than abruptly wrenching the control column. Concurrently, they practiced rigorous anti-G straining maneuvers, commencing these efforts before the pullout and maintaining them throughout the entire recovery. This involved learning to exert a forceful vocalization with each exhalation, simultaneously tensing their leg and abdominal muscles to effectively maintain vital blood perfusion in the upper torso. By August 1943, Naval Air Station Jacksonville was consistently graduating pilots capable of executing releases from 1,700 to 900 feet with circular error probables, CPs, consistently below 40 feet and a complete absence of G-induced incidents. Although this enhanced training regimen necessitated an additional 3 weeks beyond the duration of the old curriculum, the superior results proved utterly incontrovertible. Squadrons integrated with these newly proficient aviators subsequently reported demonstrated accuracy enhancements ranging from 35 to an impressive 50% when contrasted with units still adhering to pre-existing, conventional methodologies. Even more critically, the training accident rate plummeted to virtually negligible levels. While aviators undeniably continued to experience apprehension, the act of plunging to 1,800 feet before initiating recovery demanded the absolute zenith of their self-control and training. They were, crucially, no longer perishing in the pursuit of their mission. The efficacy of the technique was unequivocally proven, and the imperative now fell upon the Navy to implement this transformative methodology across every single carrier air group operating in both oceanic theaters prior to the commencement of the next major strategic operation. The innovative delayed pull-out technique subsequently underwent its inaugural large-scale operational combat evaluation during Operation Forager, a pivotal phase of the strategic invasion of the Marianas Archipelago in June 1944. Task Force 58, comprising a formidable array of 15 fleet carriers, had positioned itself within the expansive Philippine Sea, and every single dive bomber squadron assigned to these carriers had undergone comprehensive retraining in the new doctrine over the preceding 8 months. On June 19, during the aerial engagement that would forever be etched into history as the legendary Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, American dive bombers faced their supreme operational validation. Japanese carriers unleashed formidable, multi-wave strikes that left American combat air patrol controllers thoroughly inundated and overwhelmed, necessitating an urgent directive for dive bombers to retask from their primary mission of attacking enemy ships to intercepting the incoming Japanese strike packages before they could pose a threat to the American fleet. What ensued was an unparalleled examination of precision bombing efficacy within actual combat parameters. Lieutenant Commander James Ramage, commanding Bombing Squadron 10, BB-10, operating from the USS Enterprise, led his unit against a formation of Japanese carrier bombers positioned at 12,000 feet, an altitude where dive bombing had hitherto been deemed, at best, marginally effective. Employing the delayed pull-out technique, his pilots commenced their dives from considerable altitude, maintaining their trajectory directly through the core of the Japanese formation, and executing releases at altitudes below 2,000 feet, all while still hurtling earthward at speeds exceeding 280 knots. The resultant bombing accuracy proved utterly devastating. Post-action analysis of the engagement attributed to VB-10 the destruction or damage of an astounding 23 Japanese aircraft in a single pass, accuracy rates that would have been utterly unachievable utilizing the former high-altitude release methodology. Ramage's own bomb struck a K torpedo bomber with such surgical precision that the ensuing explosion disseminated debris across a quarter-mile radius. Remarkably, not one aviator within his squadron reported experiencing even a partial blackout during their recovery maneuvers. The compiled statistics emanating from the Marianas operation eloquently narrated the comprehensive narrative of the technique's success. Dive bomber squadrons, now proficient in the delayed pull-out methodology, registered a remarkable hit rate of 32% against maneuvering warships, a stark improvement when contrasted with precedent historical averages ranging from 18 to 22% observed in earlier naval engagements. During the critical strikes launched against Japanese carriers on June 20, bombs released from below 2,000 feet were responsible for 14 of the 18 unequivocal direct hits recorded by American dive bombers. The Japanese carrier Hyo, for instance, sustained 3 direct bomb strikes in swift succession from VB-2 pilots, all of whom executed their releases between 1,500 and 1,850 feet. These bombs penetrated the flight deck with such surgical exactitude that 2 projectiles entered the very same elevator shaft. The carrier subsequently succumbed to the depths within a matter of hours, and a post-war analysis of its wreckage revealed impact patterns tightly clustered within a 50-foot diameter circle, a level of accuracy that would have been considered utterly unattainable merely 18 months prior. Pilot survival statistics, too, registered an equally profound and dramatic enhancement during the 6-month period immediately following the widespread implementation of delayed pull-out training. Across all carrier air groups, the occurrence of G-induced loss of consciousness incidents plummeted by an astonishing 91%. Combat loss rates attributable to dive accidents concurrently fell to virtually statistically negligible levels, fewer than 1 pilot per 1,000 sorties, a staggering reduction when contrasted with the calamitous 15 per 1,000 recorded during the bleak period of early 1943. Thus, the innovative technique had comprehensively eradicated the pervasive blackout crisis. Yet, its impact extended far beyond mere safety. It had fundamentally redefined the operational capabilities of dive bombing. The newly acquired ability to execute precise releases from exceptionally low altitudes meant that dive bombers could now engage targets that had previously necessitated the deployment of multiple squadrons. A single aircraft could now secure decisive mission kills against destroyers, while a 2-plane section possessed the capability to effectively neutralize cruisers. By the time the arduous Okinawa campaign commenced in April 1945, the delayed pullout had become so profoundly assimilated into established dive bomber doctrine that nascent aviators arriving from training command were entirely unaware that any alternative technique had ever existed. From their very first training hop, they had been rigorously instructed to ride their dives down to 1,800 feet, rendering the old high-altitude releases perilously imprecise by comparison. The conclusive statistics compiled from the entirety of the Pacific War unequivocally demonstrated that dive bombers meticulously trained in the delayed pull-out technique accounted for the sinking or damage of 47% more enemy shipping per sortie than squadrons still employing pre-1943 methods. They achieved this remarkable feat with significantly reduced loss rates, enhanced pilot survival, and a level of accuracy that fundamentally transmuted the dive bomber from an indiscriminate area weapon into a surgical precision instrument. The technique that had appeared suicidally perilous in 1943 had, by this juncture, become the undisputed benchmark against which all other bombing methodologies were rigorously evaluated. The intrepid pilots, who had learned to prioritize the immutable principles of physics above visceral instinct, who had painstakingly trained themselves to sustain those screaming dives just a few critical seconds longer than every nerve in their body demanded, had, in essence, fundamentally redefined the operational paradigm of naval aviation. And they had accomplished this profound transformation by mastering the art of the delayed pullout.